My business partner of 9 years secretly tried to buy me out behind my back. I found out a month before the deal closed. I bought him out instead at his own price. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Story Zone. Hit that subscribe button right now because this one has everything: a 9-year friendship, a restaurant empire built from scratch, a betrayal that went all the way to the person sleeping in the same bed, and a financial reversal so precise and so brutal that when I tell you the final numbers, I need you to be sitting down. This is a story about who actually builds things, what happens when the person taking credit finally overplays their hand, and what $2.2 million in lost upside looks like when it walks out the door wearing your own shoes. Let's get into it. OP starts by saying, I want to start with the beginning because the beginning is where everything that matters actually lives. Not the betrayal. Anyone can describe a betrayal. I want to start with the restaurant, with what it felt like to build something from nothing, because you need to understand what was at stake before you can understand what was lost. And I want you to understand what was lost with the kind of precision that keeps a man up at night. My name is Marcus. I am in my mid-30s. 9 years ago I was 25 years old, working a management job at a mid-sized hospitality company, accumulating skills I intended to eventually use for myself, and sharing an apartment with my college friend Dom, who was doing something similar in sales and had the same general ambition I did without the same orientation toward the details. Dom was the kind of person who could make a room feel like a party. He remembered names, read moods, made strangers feel like they'd known him for years. I could build the system that let the party run without anyone noticing it was being run. We had talked loosely for years about going into business together. The talking became a plan. The plan became a restaurant. We each put in $150,000. Every dollar of it was real, saved over years, no family money, no shortcuts. Total startup capital of $300,000 for a fast casual concept in a mid-sized city where we had studied the market carefully and identified a gap we thought we could fill. We signed a partnership agreement 50-50 drafted by an attorney that covered the basics: decision-making authority, profit distribution, and a right of first refusal clause if either partner ever wanted to sell their stake. We shook hands, signed the documents, and got to work. The first year was the kind of hard that either breaks people or bonds them permanently. 18-hour days. Supplier negotiations I ran from a folding table in the back office. Menu revisions Dom led with input from everyone who'd eat a free test plate. Hiring, firing, training, retaining. We lost money for the first 7 months and made a small profit in month 8, and Dom and I stood in the kitchen after closing and felt something I can only describe as the specific satisfaction of a thing you built with your hands actually working. The brand grew. We opened a second location in year 2, a third in year 4. By year 4 we had a real valuation for the first time. A business broker put us at $2.1 million, which meant the $300,000 we had started with had become something genuinely significant. I remember sitting with that number and feeling proud in the quiet way I feel things, which is to say I didn't say much about it and went back to planning location 4. It was around this time that I started noticing the pattern that I would spend the next several years choosing to overlook because I trusted Dom and because the business was working and because when something is working you don't want to examine it too closely. Dom was getting press. Local food publications, a regional lifestyle magazine, an online feature that called him the visionary behind one of the city's most exciting emerging restaurant concepts. In every piece he was the founder, the creative force, the face of the brand. I was occasionally mentioned as his business partner, sometimes by name, once simply as his co-founder, and in one piece not at all. I raised it once. We were sitting in the office after a staff meeting and I said, directly and without drama, that I thought the press coverage was creating a narrative that didn't reflect how the company actually worked, and that it bothered me. Dom said I was right and that he would be more intentional about it going forward. He said it in the tone of someone who means it in the moment and will forget it by the following Tuesday. By the following Tuesday, he had given another interview. I let it go. I told myself credit didn't pay the suppliers and I went back to work. What I didn't fully understand yet, what I would only understand much later, was that Dom didn't resent the press attention. Dom resented that the people in the industry who actually understood how restaurants ran kept asking for me. The distributors called me. The commercial real estate people called me. The staff, when something was wrong, came to me. Dom was the face everyone recognized. I was the person everyone needed. And that distinction, small as it seemed, had been eating at him for years. Around year 7, I started dating Vanessa. She was sharp, easy with people, and genuinely interested in the brand in a way that felt natural rather than performative. She began helping informally, social media content, a few brand partnership conversations, the kind of ambient contribution that happens when someone you're with is good at things your company needs. Her involvement grew gradually. She had access to the apartment, to my laptop when I left it open, to the conversations I had over dinner about investor interest and expansion plans, and the internal financial picture I never thought twice about discussing at home because I trusted her completely. I want to be precise about this because precision is the only way I know how to talk about it now. Vanessa had access to the most valuable information I possessed, not the public-facing brand story, not the menu, but the operational reality. The actual margin numbers. The names of investors I had been in early conversations with. The timeline of my plans. The private financial projections I was running for a 5th location. She had that access because I gave it to her, and I gave it to her because I loved her and because it never occurred to me, not once, that she was using it. Year 8 arrived with the particular kind of pressure that comes when several bad things happen simultaneously and none of them are individually fatal, but together they create a situation that requires serious management. Food costs had climbed sharply. A new location we had opened in an emerging neighborhood was underperforming, good foot traffic, wrong demographics for our price point, a mistake I had flagged in the site analysis and overridden by Dom's enthusiasm for the space. The broader market was still recovering from disruptions that had reshaped foot traffic patterns in ways nobody had fully mapped yet. We were not in danger of collapse. I want to be clear about that because Dom's eventual framing of this period relied heavily on the word distressed. And the word distressed is doing a lot of work that the actual numbers did not support. We were under pressure. We needed to make disciplined decisions. I had a plan: renegotiate 2 supplier contracts where I had identified leverage, close the underperforming location or restructure its concept, pause expansion for 12 months, stabilize. It was not an exciting plan. It was a correct one. Dom wanted to bring in outside capital immediately. He said we needed a cash infusion to accelerate out of the rough patch rather than contract through it. We disagreed, which we had done before, and usually we worked it out. This time Dom went quiet in a way that felt different. He pulled back from day-to-day operations. He missed meetings. He was less available, vague about where he was spending his time, and when I asked he said he was working on some brand development conversations and needed space to think. I was carrying almost the entire operational load alone, and I was too busy doing it to examine his absence carefully enough. Dom was not thinking. Dom was in a conference room with a private equity group named Vantage Capital, building a deal. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in November. A commercial real estate attorney named Philip, I had worked with him once, 3 years earlier, on a lease negotiation for Location 3, called my cell and said, in the slightly careful tone of someone who is not certain they should be making this call but has decided the alternative is worse, that he had seen documentation cross his desk that week related to our company. A transaction. He said he had assumed I was aware of it. He said it with the specific hesitation of someone who was beginning to suspect I was not. I thanked him for calling. I ended the call. I sat in my car in the parking lot of our flagship location for approximately 10 minutes doing nothing. Then I went home, opened my laptop, and spent 4 hours pulling on threads. What I found, assembled piece by piece from public filings, calls to contacts, and one carefully worded conversation with my own attorney, was this: Dom had spent 6 months in structured negotiations with Vantage Capital to engineer a buyout of my 50% stake. The deal was framed as a distressed asset transaction, our rough patch presented as existential crisis, my share valued accordingly. The number Dom's team had assigned to my stake was $1.7 million, a valuation that placed the entire company at $3.4 million, a figure that was artificially suppressed by the framing and significantly below what a clean operational assessment would have supported. Dom would retain his 50% stake, take on Vantage as a majority backer, and emerge as the sole named founder and operating partner of the company I had spent 8 years building. The closing window was 30 days out. 30 days. Dom had given himself 30 days. It was the first significant miscalculation he made. I did not call Dom. I called my attorney, a woman named Sandra who had been practicing business litigation for 18 years, and had a manner of absolute composure that I had always found reassuring and now found essential. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Pull the partnership agreement. Specifically the right of first refusal clause." The clause was there. We had both signed it 9 years ago at a table in Sandra's office, a provision stating that if either partner received a bona fide offer to purchase their stake, the other partner had the right to match that offer and acquire the stake themselves under identical terms. Dom had structured a deal to buy me out. The clause meant I could use that same deal to buy him out instead. His own terms, his own price. The trap he had built for me fit him perfectly. I had 30 days. I used them. The first week I spent with Sandra mapping the legal strategy and assembling the documentation, financials, operational records, the 9-year paper trail of my actual contributions to the company. The second week I worked my network. I called every legitimate contact I had built in 9 years of operations, investors who had watched us grow, real estate partners who had done deals with me personally, colleagues in the industry who knew my track record. Not Dom's pitch deck. My actual numbers, my actual history, my actual word. By the end of week 2, I had verbal commitments for bridge financing from 2 investors. A man named Gerald who had supplied materials for our build-outs and had watched me renegotiate 3 contracts on his behalf over the years. And a woman named Christine, a regional hospitality investor who had tried to get a meeting with us twice before and both times been redirected to Dom, who had not followed up. Christine took my call on the first ring. I walked her through the numbers. She said, "I've been waiting for you to call me directly for 2 years. When do you need the funds?" It was during week 2 that something else began to crystallize. I was reviewing Dom's deal documents, the ones his attorneys had submitted in discovery through the legal challenge Sandra had filed, and I kept finding details that should not have been there. Specific numbers from internal projections I had run privately. The name of an investor I had been in preliminary conversations with, conversations I had not documented anywhere Dom could access. A timeline that mapped precisely to planning discussions I had conducted from home. I sat with this for a day. I traced the information backward the way I trace every operational problem, systematically, without assumption, following the chain of access. Dom did not have access to my home office. Dom did not have access to my private email. The internal projections had been run on my personal laptop and saved to a personal drive. There was one other person who had been in my apartment at my laptop, present for the conversations. One person who had been acting slightly differently for the past several weeks, phone screen angling away, responses slightly delayed, a particular quality of distraction I had cataloged and not yet named. I checked the shared company accounts she had access to for brand work. I found a thread I was not supposed to find. For months of emails between Vanessa and Dom. She had been feeding him information since the summer, financial projections, investor names, my private planning timeline, anything that would give Dom's team an edge in structuring a deal I couldn't react to in time. In return, Dom had promised her a percentage of the proceeds once he held full ownership. He had put the number in writing. It was $180,000. I read the thread twice. I saved everything to a drive Dom and Vanessa did not know existed. I closed the laptop. I went to bed. I did not say a single word to Vanessa that night, and I would not say a single word about it for 2 more weeks, because I had 30 days and I was going to use every one of them before I spent a single moment on something that was no longer the priority. The countermove executed on day 29. Sandra filed the legal challenge citing the right of first refusal clause. Vantage Capital's attorneys, who had apparently not been told about the clause or had assumed it was unenforceable on the timeline, pushed back. Sandra held firm. The clause was valid, the offer was bona fide, and Marcus had the right to match it under identical terms. The bridge financing from Gerald and Christine was in place. The paperwork was ready. Dom's deal with Vantage collapsed. My acquisition of Dom's 50% stake closed at $1.7 million, the exact number Dom's team had assigned to a half share of a company they had deliberately undervalued. Dom had spent 6 months and significant legal fees engineering a transaction designed to pay me $1.7 million for my share of our company. Instead, he received $1.7 million for his. Dom called me at 7:30 in the morning the day the papers were signed. I let it ring. He called again. I answered the second call. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. He said I had stolen his company. I told him the valuation was his number, prepared by his attorneys, submitted to his investors. I told him the timeline was his timeline. I told him the clause was in the agreement we had both signed at a table in Sandra's office in the first month of our partnership. I told him that if he had concerns about any of those things, he was welcome to take them up with his attorneys, who should have caught all of them. He said some other things. I waited until he was done. Then I said, it was our company. And then I said was, past tense. And I ended the call. That evening I sat Vanessa down at the kitchen table. I placed my phone between us with the email thread open to the first message. I didn't ask questions. I told her what I had found, when I had found it, and what it meant. I told her that I needed her out of my apartment by the end of the week. She tried to explain. She said Dom had approached her, that it had seemed like it would work out for everyone, that she hadn't understood the full picture of what she was participating in. I listened to all of it without expression. Then I stood up, went to the bedroom, and closed the door. Before the week was out, I forwarded the email thread to the relevant people in our shared professional network. Not as a campaign, as a matter of record. The brand partnership contacts she had cultivated through my company. The industry people who had come to know her through me. The investor community is not large and the hospitality industry is smaller still. Vanessa found doors that had been open quietly closing. Dom never paid her the $180,000. Dom didn't have it, the deal that was supposed to generate it had collapsed, and what Dom had instead of a majority-owned restaurant empire was $1.7 million, a bruised ego, and an industry that was beginning to hear the outline of what had happened. She reached out to Dom. Dom did not respond. She reached out to me once in a message that moved between apology and explanation and something that wasn't quite a request but wasn't not one either. I read it. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that the forwarded emails hadn't already said more efficiently. She had handed over the most valuable thing I had given her, my trust, for a promise made by someone who was never going to be in a position to keep it. The credit card debt she had been counting on Dom's payout to address remained exactly where it was. I don't think about her often. When I do, it's with the specific blankness of someone who has fully drained a tank and found there's nothing left in it. Dom was not finished. Over the 6 weeks following the buyout, 2 of our locations received anonymous complaints to the city health department. The complaints were specific enough to suggest someone with inside knowledge of our operations, vague enough to be unprovable. Both inspections came back clean. I run clean operations, have always run clean operations, and every protocol was documented with the kind of paper trail that makes a spurious complaint collapse on contact with reality. Then coordinated negative reviews appeared across 3 platforms, a cluster of them in a single week, the kind of pattern that shows up in the data when you're looking for it. Then a rumor about a rodent problem at our flagship location started moving through a mutual contact network, third-hand and deniable. I documented each incident with dates and specifics. I let the first 2 waves pass without response. When the third arrived, I had Sandra send a letter to Dom's personal attorney. The letter was precise and brief. It listed every incident, every date, every connection point, and it outlined clearly what the next communication would be if the pattern continued. It was not a long letter. The last line did the work. The sabotage stopped. I filed the letter and moved on. With full ownership and clean books, I executed the plan I had always had. I renegotiated the 2 supplier contracts where I had identified leverage, saving $340,000 annually in combined costs. I closed the underperforming location rather than continuing to carry it, a decision that took 2 months to implement cleanly and immediately improved the margin picture across the remaining portfolio. I promoted 2 managers, a woman named Diane who had been running our kitchen operations for 4 years, and a man named Robert who had built our entire front-of-house training program, into senior leadership roles Dom had consistently told me they weren't ready for. They were ready. They had been ready. Dom hadn't wanted the competition for the spotlight. I opened the 5th location in year 9, then a 6th. The operational systems I had spent 8 years building and refining ran the way they always could have run when decisions didn't have to clear a partner who resented the person making them. By year 10, the company, 6 locations, clean margins, documented and replicable systems, a genuine regional brand, carried a valuation that bore no resemblance to the $3.4 million Dom's team had submitted to Vantage Capital during the rough patch. The business was valued at $8.2 million. The rough patch, it turned out, had required discipline rather than panic. Discipline had been applied. The results were visible. The acquisition offer came in the spring of year 10. A regional hospitality group named Cornerstone, which operated across 4 states and was building out its portfolio in our market, made a formal approach. The number they opened with was $9 million. I negotiated. We went back and forth over 8 weeks, cleanly and professionally, with Sandra managing the documentation. The final number was $7.8 million. I want to stay with that number for a moment because the math that follows is the part of the story I think about most. Dom sold his 50% stake in our company for $1.7 million. At the time of the Cornerstone acquisition, a 50% stake in the company was worth $3.9 million. Dom lost $2.2 million in upside minimum by engineering a scheme that handed him his own exit price. He spent 6 months, significant legal fees, Vanessa's access to my private information, and the entirety of a 9-year friendship to sell himself out of a company for $2.2 million less than he would have received by simply staying. The Cornerstone deal was covered in 2 trade publications and a regional business journal. The numbers were in every piece. Dom read the coverage. I know this because of what happened next. About 3 weeks after the acquisition closed, Dom began talking. Quietly at first, then less quietly, telling people in the industry that he was a co-founder of the brand, that the concept had been his vision, that the acquisition reflected years of work he had contributed. He gave an interview to a regional food publication that ran under a headline about the city's most successful recent hospitality exits. Dom was quoted extensively. He used the word "we" throughout. He described stepping away from the company to pursue other interests. He did not mention the buyout. He did not mention the right of first refusal clause. He did not mention Vantage Capital or the $1.7 million or any of the events of the previous 2 years. He was counting on me to stay quiet. I had stayed quiet before. I had let 9 years of first-person singular press coverage pass without meaningful response. He had every reason to believe the pattern would hold. The journalist covering the Cornerstone acquisition for the Regional Business Journal reached out to me for comment. He had read Dom's interview. He asked carefully and professionally whether I could speak to Dom's characterization of his role in the company and his departure from it. I told him I appreciated him asking directly. I said I was happy to speak to the record. My response was 1 paragraph. Contained the date of the buyout. It contained the price Dom had received for his stake. It contained the name of the clause in the partnership agreement that had governed the transaction. It contained the delta between Dom's exit price and what a 50% stake had been worth at the time of the Cornerstone sale. I did not characterize any of it. I did not use adjectives. I let the numbers speak because numbers, in my experience, do not require assistance. The paragraph ran in full. The trade publications picked it up. The industry read it over the course of about a week, the way the industry reads things, through forwarded emails and group chats and the specific word of mouth that moves through tight professional communities faster than any press release. Dom gave no further interviews. His calls to mutual contacts, which had been increasing in frequency in the weeks after the acquisition coverage, stopped. Here is where I am now. The $7.8 million from Cornerstone was distributed according to the ownership structure, which was, by the time of the sale, entirely mine. Gerald and Christine, who had backed me on bridge financing when I needed it most, had been compensated with returns that I made sure reflected what their faith had actually been worth. I was not generous out of obligation. I was generous because those were the people who answered the phone when I called, and I know what that is worth. Diane and Robert are running operations for Cornerstone's expansion of the brand into 2 new markets. I made sure the acquisition terms included their roles and their compensation. They had built those operations. I was not going to sell the work without protecting the people who did it. I have a new apartment. I have a clean financial picture. I have work I find genuinely meaningful with Cornerstone in an advisory capacity that lets me keep building without carrying everything alone. I have, for the first time in 9 years, A professional life that does not require me to manage someone else's ego alongside the actual business. People ask me sometimes whether I feel bad about how it ended with Dom. Whether the number, that $2.2 million gap between what he got and what he could have had, is too much, too harsh, more than was necessary. I tell them, Dom chose the number. Dom's attorneys submitted the valuation. Dom structured the timeline. Dom signed the partnership agreement that contained the clause. Dom decided, after 9 years of building something together, that the right move was to go behind my back, use the woman I trusted in my own home, and try to engineer my exit from a company I had spent 8 years making worth something. Every consequence that followed was built from materials Dom assembled himself. I just used them. Dom built the face of the brand. I built the thing the face was attached to. The cornerstone acquisition was the market's assessment of which of those two things was actually worth $7.8 million. I didn't need to say anything else. The number said it for me. If this one hit you, and I think it did, you know what to do. Subscribe to the Story Zone, drop a like, and tell me in the comments. When Marcus found those emails on Vanessa's thread, what would you have done differently? And was that one paragraph to the journalist the coldest thing in this whole story? Or was it something else? I read every comment. We'll see you in the next one.